This is ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is the Russia folder. Russian President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has had little reason of late to be happy with anything at the UN or UN headquarters. With the universal or near universal, except for his clones, condemnation of the land grab that was the takeover of Crimea, with anxiety, angst, and anger over Russian actions in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk, with questions about who pulled the trigger of a Russian-made missile that shot down a Malaysian airliner still hanging. The UN has not been the favorite venue of the man in the Kremlin. In fact, this year, he skipped the opportunity to come to the opening session of the General Assembly and vent his spleen or bash Americans or say things about how Western values were corrupting Russian values. But this week, he has a hero at the UN, Alessio Bruni. Mr. Bruni presented a report, 16 pages, outlining how the United States had been violating the International Convention Against Torture, how its domestic policies were cruel and abusive. In a presentation that was long on specifics, Bruni assailed the United States for being outside the bounds of human decency and decent human conduct. He said that the interrogation rules of the United States needed to be clarified, modified, and made more modern. He said that torture that had gone on under President Bush the Younger, had still not been fully investigated, that there was an epidemic of the shooting of unarmed and innocent, or perhaps not quite innocent, African Americans across America. And they also went after the practice of solitary confinement in American prisons as cruel and unusual. In specific and quite heated language, the report from the Committee from the UN Convention Against Torture said that the draconian system of secret detention, secret interrogation, and holding of high-value target people in Guantanamo Bay needed to be examined and reconsidered. And they said there had to be some kind of limit put on those being held under the broad rubric of terrorism. It was a hard-hitting, tough report. Tough is what Putin would like to be increasingly with the West and the United States. His rhetoric has it. His actions are pulling it up. He's talked and of late has shown that Russia is on its way. They've laid down the keels for a number of diesel-powered submarines that can challenge the Americans in the shallow waters around the Arabian Gulf and in the Mediterranean. They have just tested for another time up in the Arctic a Bulva ICBM, a new kind of intercontinental ballistic missile launched from a nuclear-powered submarine. The Russians are doing this as the colding that is coalescing into a new Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev has warned about this. The former Soviet leader said that there are some people who believe we are already in a Cold War, and that others that we are about to embark on a Cold War. certainly things are getting cold. But not only are things getting cold, things are getting desperate. The Russian ruble has just been plummeting in value. These bills, pretty bills of the new currency of Russia, are, well, one of these was worth about $3.40 in the spring. If they're worth $2, it's a lot today. People are preferring in Russia to hang on to these, even though it's not seen as necessary, or not seen as necessary by the government. They're ruling out Russians holding foreign currency. Russians are trying to put their assets abroad. American assets are not going in because of basic business decisions and sanctions. Investment in Russia is down significantly. The country is hemorrhaging foreign capital. The best minds are talking about leaving. To try and balance the budget somewhat, somehow, or to punish the yummies, young, upperly middle-class Muscovites, there's talk of putting on a 17% tariff on airline tickets to get out of Russia. With oil prices falling, there is again consideration that an oil and exporting economy like Russia's is in dire trouble when world oil prices fall. Brent crude, the benchmark, has gone down from about $117 a barrel in June to hovering around $70 now. Yegor Gaidar, the man who brought economic pain and bankrupted many babushki, Russian grandmothers, when he instituted Boris Yeltsin's shock therapy, guided by Jeffrey Sachs, the American economist so hailed here and so reviled in Russia. Yegor Gaidar said in a book not long before he died that had Russia, had the Soviet Union, had a higher price for oil in the Brezhnev years when it was down below $30, that the demise of the Soviet Union might not, in economic terms, never mind political terms, have come about the way it did, when it did, or so abruptly. The dependence on oil and the oil economy, the natural energy economy, is a disease among Russians. And as their other great capital achievement, the capital of their intellect, their intellectual capital, is increasingly alienated. They're left with farms and exports that aren't worth a lot. Oh, they do have an export, however, that's getting a lot of attention. An unintentional export, one they'd really like to have back. In an episode that could have been, in other circumstances, cause for war, or at least for a great documentary thriller, two ruthless Russian killers have transgressed, gone across, without visas, the Russian-Chinese border. These two huge, hulking killers are wreaking havoc in China. The two miscreants who swam the Amur River and are now on a killing rampage are two Amur tigers. Found a couple years ago in the Rusi taiga, nearly starving, they were brought back into Russian hands, brought back to health, nurtured under the supervision of President Putin himself. And Kuza and Ustin were raised to be large, healthy beasts with healthy Amur tiger desires, instincts. They were fitted with the latest in GPS technology. They're being tracked, and they made tracks. They crossed the Amur River. They went from the Amur region in Russia into the Heilongjiang district in China. In other words, they went from a province in Russia with under 1 million souls to, well, let's see. The official definition of Heilongjiang province is in excess of 38 million souls. The Tigers, first Kuzya, raided a chicken coop, murdered in bloody fashion at least 5 Chinese chickens. Of late, this week, we hear from the Xinhua news agency that Ustin may be responsible for slaying in brutal fashion 2 goats. It said that their skulls were crushed, that there were puncture holes in them the size of human fingers. The Chinese don't seem too bent out of shape about this. The Chinese and the Russians are, of course, getting closer together. They've just signed a 30-year, $400 billion natural gas deal. They seem to have a meeting of the minds on a number of issues, nationalist issues, keeping Tibet, keeping Crimea, keeping quiet about each other's human rights transgressions. But the Tigers, well, the Tigers just headed off on their own. The Chinese have promised their Russian comrades that they will protect the Tigers from poachers. And this is a real threat. The Chinese believe that tigers, especially Siberian, or more correctly, Amur tigers, their bones, their ears, their teeth, possess special medicinal properties, a kind of natural Viagra. Chinese government has promised to protect the animals. Russians would like nothing better if they swam back to Mother Russia, to come back to where they were raised in the taiga by the Russians under the patronage of Mr. Putin. For those suspicious, superstitious, or just mystical, the idea that Kuzya and Ustin chose to leave and go abroad